Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 14, Annexed, Part 2. Only a year older now, Marco sat in the school's uniform at a young age of 13. But now, his name no longer the same. He wore a school name badge that read Arlo Brooks, and as he sat in his school library, he looked across the table and spoke quietly to his new female friend. He rarely got a chance to speak with her. In fact, he did not get a chance for much of anything anymore. And while he listened to her talk, becoming lost in her eyes, he felt as if they could go on for an eternity. While she spoke softly to him, her lips seemed perfectly soft, as her skin was like porcelain without a single flaw. And looking into her eyes, he felt they were simply dreamy as he lost himself within them, while her words were like those of a heavenly angel. Arlo, unable to mask his boyish crush on his friend, knew she felt the same for him, as over the past several months he had slowly confided in her regarding his most personal matters. He had told her how his parents were no longer in his life, and how he believed he felt he knew why, feeling he was being held by the ones responsible for them no longer being there. He secretly longed to return home to find out what had really happened to his family. As the two young students sat quietly talking, they sat at a table of more than several dozen as their surroundings were somewhat expansive. It was an overly spacious study hall that had 2 levels inside, the second floor only wrapping the overhead borders of the first level below. And what seemed like nearly an acre of tables and chairs. Each section that surrounded the large center had deep recesses of very tall wooden bookshelves. He listened carefully to his female companion, Anastasia, but found himself somewhat perplexed by her next words. He listened to her speak as she suggested a solution, but only grew slightly anxious as he began looking around. With his heart rate slightly increased, his panic seemed to be coming to an end as she quickly summed up her suggestion of dissent. "Seriously, I'll go with you. We can leave tonight," she whispered. Marco slowed his companion's plot down, as he had already learned how consequences can quickly stack against him over this most recent year. "I don't know. I guess I just want to talk about it sometimes. Besides, I'm not sure if I'm just being paranoid. I mean, that thing really existed. I didn't just imagine it. Maybe my town really was all killed by that thing. Anyway, we should drop it. I'm not allowed to talk about it. They told me it's classified or something like that." But his girlfriend, only knowing him a short while, simply loved him too much, and knowing she couldn't possibly break her promise to him and tell her parents, she pressed the matter further. "We can go to the police. You should be missing somewhere, right? Besides, I don't want to see you hurt anymore," she desperately stated. And knowing his real name, she continued even more quietly than before. "I love you, Mr. Marcos Kozlov. I have, ever since I saw that adorable dimple of yours." The two then laughed, but were soon interrupted by an adult that approached their table as they realized they had increased their volume with their childish giggles. They looked at each other and gave stupid grins as the adult began to address them. They knew the speech as they had heard it many times before. "Keep your voices down, children," they would say. "You are in a library, children, blah, blah, blah." And as they prepared for the expected lecture, Marcos's expression completely changed as Anastasia's face became extremely confused. "Young lady, please come with me," the man said, now standing over them while looking at Marcos very seriously. The look he had given the young boy would have been enough on its own to give Arlo a good case of the shivers. Instead, he became terrified of something else as he gazed up at the man before them. Now, with a rush of cold blood flowing to his extremities, he quickly recognized the man as one of his original captors. Completely unable to speak, not wanting to make things worse for her, he turned pale as a ghost as he sat there in silence, still holding the older man's gaze, not quite sure what to do. Feeling as though he had been caught red-handed, he watched his friend leave as she was guided from the building. And before she disappeared, she turned her head and met his eyes as he watched her leave, not knowing that this would be the last time he would ever see her face. He would soon learn a few weeks later, simply by word of mouth at his school, that she was no longer a student. And as the reason for his friend's absence was more than the poor boy could handle, he found himself alone once more, his new girlfriend supposedly having committed suicide in the recent days. And being that it was in the mid-1900s, suicide was looked at as poor judgment rather than a problem needing attention, as nasty rumors of his departed friend quickly began to spread. It took him a few weeks longer than the rest of his classmates to learn of this, because later that evening, after she had been removed from his table, Arlo was escorted home. After that, it took him several weeks to recover from all his wounds before he was allowed to return to his teachers and classmates. Going forward, Arlo made a promise to himself, knowing that he would never be able to let anyone truly inside. There, within his young and developing mind, he swore to never love anyone, ever again. Over the years, all his loved ones simply having vanished before his very own eyes, Arlo began to feel numb to it all as he turned to his studies, now the only thing in his life that he could confide in. As he began to retreat slowly within his mind, less and less of Marcos remained, as Arlo became the new one in charge. While the young boy's soul seemed to grow much darker, an emptiness slowly filled his eyes. Now, many years and the better part of a century later, Arlo had become a very respectable businessman as he sat in a chair with a woman at his side. Despite being Russian and paler as a child, he now seemed to hold a somewhat darker tone. And not maturing as fast as all his peers around him, he appeared that of a younger man, still only appearing middle-aged. He also had an advantage that he seemed to enjoy, as he never grew tired or sick, affording him the ability to watch man's achievements over the decades through consistently sharpened eyes. And now, in his mid-80s, but only appearing to be in his late 20s, he never grew weary of the constant and rapid change constantly taking place around him. Turning out to be just the right man for the life he now grew to love, he quickly became known by his colleagues and peers for being on top of new research and technology. Now, embracing who he had become, he soon found himself surrounded by a world much more advanced than he had ever imagined as a much younger boy. Having been in both Russian and American militaries, he held a rather capable physique as he sat there, sporting a finely trimmed mustache and a darker shade of hair on his head. And the gorgeous female who sat by his side completed the display of an attractive young Russian couple. She wore a long black gown to match Arlo's dark black suit, as she held a beautiful smile under breathtaking curly blonde hair. With her piercing green eyes, she looked forward with Arlo at her side, while he simply held a smug-like grin. They were both sitting in a very large office that was designed with excellent taste, while her arm was placed nicely over his. To all sides of them hung large, priceless artwork, each one of them cased in their very own golden frames. And they were displayed upon dark maroon walls, with braids of thick golden molding, which expanded the walls, edges upon ceiling and floor. And just before them sat a large wooden desk that appeared black with a deep glowing red from within its veneer. And on the other side of this desk sat a Russian man slightly overweight with a beard and eyeglasses, who also seemed to be nearing his 30s. Sitting across from Arlo while wearing a dark blue suit, he looked past the two in front of him and waved someone forward. It was at that time exactly Arlo spoke up, announcing the meeting's subject at hand. Then, as Arlo spoke, the man who was beckoned forth passed an envelope across the desk. "This is my current employer's contract. Sign this and my service will be all yours. But first, you must send me with the agreed upon initial installment." As he said this, and without hesitation, the man across from him snapped his fingers. Just then, a different man came up to the desk between the three and presented a briefcase. After opening it, he turned it toward Arlo and smiled. Arlo nodded his head in approval at the obscene amount of money inside. Then, closing the briefcase, he began to speak while Arlo watched him reset the combination to the case. "Your former employer is aware of the combination. Now, Mr. Brooks," he said, looking back up to Arlo while quickly signing several papers that he had removed from the envelope. "I will sign this contract, and then you will be a wealthy man. And together, with you at my side, we shall rule all of Mother Russia," he stated as he let a deep rolling laugh follow his very own words. Arlo smiled back as he sat in deep thought. And though he looked at the businessman with a smile under his casual demeanor, he held a great amount of resentment for him. He watched his new employer pass the briefcase back to one of his own employer's men, as he knew very well what he was witnessing before him. He knew that the briefcase before them represented a small down payment on his life, as his current employer began to arrange a transfer of ownership. But as Arlo sat there, still with a grin on his face, he now held a burning hatred for the man across from him. But now, only possessing the gift of long life, there was nothing he could do about the situation he found himself in. And feeling as if he were simply being sold to the highest bidder, he quickly transferred full responsibility of his fate onto the shoulders of the young oligarch that now sat just before him. Now, completely dismissing all blame on his former owners, he now had his hatred gathered at one man, who was now sitting across the large black table between them. But feeling that this would go nowhere, as he simply had no way to fight back, he sat there with a smile instead, as he thought over his typical rationalizations. He pondered his lavish lifestyle and the beautiful women that adored him. He figured, staying in line as one person's property to receive such a wealthy lifestyle was a rather small price to pay, especially having been born a poor child in communist Russia. Then suddenly, out of the blue, Arlo felt a weird sensation as a powerful feeling began to take over his entire body. While only lasting a second or so, he felt completely invincible as strange images flashed before his racing mind. And as if able to simply make complete sense of it all, his smile slightly grew as he watched the images now represent a clear view of what was to come. Unbeknownst to those around him, he now knew that his potentials would start to grow while he sat there in silence and dreamed of the very near future. and taking this fraction of a moment to reflect. It had seemed, after all, his luck was finally changing. It would appear a long life and the ability to speak a foreign alien language was not his only gift he had received as a small boy. He stared at the man in front of him, as he knew, this time, things will now be much different. Then, rising to their feet, Arlo and the oligarch solidified the deal. Mr. Brooks smiled as he leaned forward, welcoming the extended arm of his new boss as they firmly began to shake each other's hands. And then, addressing the young oligarch one last time, he spoke as the most subtle, dark flash sparked across his eyes for the very first time. "It will be a pleasure to work for you, Mr. Lenkov." Suddenly, as if being catapulted to a scene not long ago, one could find themselves being rushed down several familiar hallways. However, this time, unlike before, Arlo Brooks was now the figure who briskly walked upon these heavenly floors. As he quickly marched forward, he was being escorted by 4 armed men, all in similar black and yellow security uniforms. As they surrounded him, each holding a rifle to their chest, they did not shift their attention away from the direction they escorted their subject in. And as each one marched in their armored uniforms, over their heads, they wore black helmets, each having tinted face shields as they escorted Mr. Brooks through the halls. While Arlo was directed by his escort through the corridors before him, he looked on with an expression of arrogance as several onlookers took notice of the high-ranking officer currently under arrest. Without looking back at them, and remaining very focused on the direction ahead, it was Arlo who led the pace of his guards, as he held a casual look while partially hiding a rather menacing grin. And marching through the halls, while passing several others, they eventually came to a familiar stop as a guard before them accessed a set of steel doors straight ahead. And as they parted wide open, the final corridor came into view with windows lining its walls, displaying the darkness of space just outside. Meanwhile, in a large room not too far away, Lenkov sat at a desk with a massive window behind him. Planet Earth centered within the vastness of space. As he studied a screen within the desk itself, he sipped on a cup of coffee while smoking a cigar, going over his current daily reports. Wearing a dark suit, the office around him made it that much darker, while the lights were somewhat dimmed, leaving the room in a soft, amber-like glow. As he took another sip, he listened to his favorite classical music, playing ever so softly just overhead. Suddenly, the doors before him began to open as he quickly put his cigar out in a large ashtray on his desk. And as expected, Arlo walked through the now open doors with 4 men at his side, each still holding their rifles to their chests. Lenkov, now looking at his disobedient employee, cued his men to leave him and Arlo alone for a private conversation. The 4 then saluted their commander as they each made an immediate about-face and quickly walked out the doors, leaving Mr. Brooks to stand before his superior. Now, completely alone. Lenkov looked at Arlo as he noticed him looking around the room while smiling, ignoring his angered superior before him. Scowling and growing angrier by the minute, he studied Arlo, not sure what to make of his rogue investment. And as the doors finally closed, Lenkov watched as Arlo studied the large war room, eventually leading his gaze back to the aging oligarch as he threw his employer a very large grin. Kostya, now utterly disgusted at his employee's silence, and now seeing his menacing smirk, became quite unhinged as he quickly laid into him with a deep and booming voice. "Thousands of assets have been lost in China. Sources tell me you are giving orders to their military. They say the generals are in bed with you. They tell me that several bases in the desert have simply vanished into thin air, nothing but a hole in its place. They also say DX4 has been spotted in the hands of military personnel. You should not be meddling with earthly affairs. Your business is Darius. I do not know what your game is, Mr. Brooks, but I have my eyes on you now. Things are out of control in South America. We cannot lose America. If the Chinese see us as weak, the powers that be will quickly shift. What good will you be to me then, you fucking twit? Our deal with China does not protect us if they see we are weak in the South. And you used to be such a good boy, always doing what you are told. But now this, he stated as he then stood up and pointed at Arlo. Mr. Brooks, your days of mocking my empire are over. You no longer have Mother Russia in your back pocket. When I am through with you, I will be sure you are left on the dark side of Darius, where you belong. Just then, Lenkov collapsed to the desk below him as he reached for his throat. And now, his face firmly planted in the hard surface of his desk, he desperately gasped for a breath as he heard Arlo approach. And as he did so, panic set in, as Arlo now seemed to glide toward him with ease, his hands tucked behind his back while eerily leaning forward, giving Lenkov a troubling glare. As instincts quickly set in, Lenkov reached for a panic button positioned under his desk, but was soon met with the sounds of large bolts taking their place within the large metal doors of the oversized suite. And looking up at Arlo, never having seen him exhibit such strength, he clung to his life as his last breaths seemed to be swept past his very own lips. And watching him come closer, as if he hadn't already seen enough, he noticed Arlo's eyes turn pitch black and felt a voice echo through his racing mind. Brooks began to speak, his eyes still growing darker, as his lips did not even seem to move. And as it resonated within Kostia's deepest thoughts, Arlo's voice swept about, like tiny grains of sand, over a vast and now vacant desert. While he spoke, the subtle sound of classical music still played above the oligarch's desk. I grow weary of your whining, Kostya Lenkov, Arlo stated, as he closed the distance between the two. However, unlike your predecessors, you have been good to me, my dear friend. But I will not suffer you, for it is me who has let you live. And of late, I hear nothing but disagreements from my inferior before me. Lenkov, hearing these words of disrespect, simply lacked the capability to look up, as breathing seemed to be his current and most challenging task. But then, to the oligarch's dismay, Arlo reached forward both his hands and placed them on the Russian's ears as he continued to speak, still not moving his lips. You are now a weak, elderly man, Lenkov. Have you not noticed your apprentice now towering over you? Have you not heard all the rumors, my old friend? Then, Arlo slightly cocked his head and drew an expression as if to think. And as he continued to telepathically mock his victim before him, he softly chuckled while he continued to speak. Or is your ego too large? Perhaps you simply looked away all these years as a pathetic attempt in self-preservation. Then, adding to the discomfort of complete suffocation, pain began to stack up as Lenkov felt Arlo's finger sink deep into his ears. And losing the ability to distinguish finger from ear, blood began slipping down the old man's bearded face as Arlo continued to speak. While his last breath slipped out, Lenkov peered up as his own fleeting eyes began to match his aggressors with a deep shade of black. And as his eardrums were breached, ultimately being punctured deep within, the voice seemed to now come from his very own mind. Trembling in fear and seeming unable to simply perish, the words echoed about his now seized and empty head. As Arlo leaned in, he met Lenkov's gaze as the blood began to flow even more. And with his eyes, now even darker than ever before, Arlo's final words spelled the oligarch's fate. "I have different plans for you now, my human comrade," he sternly stated. Suddenly, Kostya had terrifying images now playing before his mind, while Arlo grew a dreadful smile, feeling a moment of ecstasy, compliments of his captive's pain. And as he softly closed his eyes, letting the classical music overtake his thoughts, he began to enjoy the sounds over their heads while he addressed the oligarch one last time. "Yes, old friend, you are now mine, and you will be mine forever."